Okay, welcome everyone to today's conversation, Preparing for the Public. I'm Mary Chapman. I'm the Academic Director at the Public Humanities Hub at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the time you've already spent to submit questions to our discussion. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Public Humanities Hub is located on the unsurrendered traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. These lands were sites of learning for many generations before UBC was built here, and we recognize our obligations as scholars and learners to ensure that the work we do upholds the best of that long-standing learning context. I invite anyone who would like to post in the chat their acknowledgement of the lands on which they are situated. Today's session, organized by the Hub's graduate academic assistant, Sydney Lines, is part of the Hub's Public Scholarship Series. This series includes presentations about a range of publishing activities that are intended to foster knowledge exchange between UBC and the public. We believe that with access to tools, methods, and resources, any humanities scholar can become a public scholar. So these presentations reflect on the possibilities of genres within and beyond the academic article and the traditional monograph. They explore how humanities faculty and students can share their research more broadly and participate in the reciprocity of community-engaged work. So the recorded presentations of events in this series are posted on the Hub's YouTube channel, which is linked to our events page. And Hub staff have also built valuable public scholarship toolkits to assist in the skill building required to do this work. These are posted on our resource page and open to anyone. Please consult them. And if you'd like to hear more about upcoming events in the Public Scholarship Series, please sign up for our newsletter on our contact page. The Hub also co-sponsors visiting lectures and screenings. So later today, we have several panel discussions of Refugee Life Worlds, a book by former UBC scholar Yidang Trung, who passed away 100 days ago. And tomorrow, the Hub is co-sponsoring a lecture by visiting British historian Olivette Otele, entitled A Past That Keeps on Giving, Britain's Colonial and Post-Colonial Amnesia. Please see our event page for more info on these two events and others happening soon. Today's session addresses the following questions. What should a scholar consider when preparing to take their work public, or when the public becomes a focus of their research? What are the risks, concerns, and rewards of being a public scholar or doing scholarly work in public? Joining us today are two scholars who have given these questions consideration, Dr. Xine Yao and Dr. Danielle Wong. Some of you may have met Xine earlier this last spring at her Hub-sponsored talk about her book, Disaffected, The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th Century America, which won Duke University Press's Scholars of Color First Book Award. Xine is lecturer at University College London, co-director of the Queer Studies Network, QUCL, a BBC Radio 3 HRC New Generation Thinker, and the co-host of the popular PhD Thus podcast. Danielle Wong is assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures at UBC, where she also teaches in the Asian Migration Studies program. Her research focuses on the intersections between race, empire, and new media. Dr. Wong's peer-reviewed and public scholarship has been published in journals and magazines like Society in Space, Post 45, Theatre Research in Canada, and Transformations. We're so happy to have both of you here with us today. Now I'll turn the mic over to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I am echoing sentiments of excitement to be with you all. Thanks for popping in to our conversation. I'm just going to echo a note that Sydney has placed in the comment in our chat. So Sydney is encouraging us to put questions that you might want to see us take up in the Q&A period. We're hoping to do that by 11, if not sooner. So if you have a question or want to respond to something that comes up in the conversation, feel free to use the chat function, and Sydney will facilitate or help us incorporate that in our conversation at the latter end of Xine and my discussion. And I'm so excited to be, even if it's Zoom, with you, Xine, and to have a chat with you. Thanks for doing this. We're so excited to hear from you. I thought that we would just structure conversation today into like two batches of questions. And first, I just want to give some space and time to think about your work specifically via podcasting, and hopefully we'll also think about podcasts as a medium. Maybe you can like zoom out a bit and talk about it too. But first, I wanted to launch things off so that we can get to know you a bit better, but also think about your specific work with podcasts. So I know that you co-host a podcast, which you started in graduate school with Dr. Liz Wayne, the podcast PhD Divas. I get the pun right. So how did your podcast PhD Divas with Dr. Liz Wayne come to be? Can you talk about perhaps, and you can take up any directions, can you talk about how you arrived at wanting to host a podcast in the first place? Why a podcast? And specifically from the perspective of women of color, people of color in the Ivy League PhD programs. And if you want, perhaps how that might have shifted, if maybe it hasn't, or changed shape now that you are a professor. So any of that you want to pick up on, we'd love to hear about.
So thank you so much, Danielle. I'm so delighted that you agreed to be in conversation with me. It's a real honor. I'm speaking to all of you from the former heart of empire, London, England. So from the metropole, hello, 8 hours away, at least 8 time zones away, I think. So let's see, where to begin? PhDivas came out of just the confluence of interdisciplinary intimacies that is just like living and working with people in different disciplines. Liz and I, to save money and to make money during our PhDs, both worked as graduate residence fellows at Cornell and one of the houses for upper year undergraduates. And Liz is based in biomedical engineering and chemical engineering now at Carnegie Mellon. But we found that we were often tag teaming one another while talking about questions that students would have about any sort of pop culture, issues of race, gender, power in general, and that we were able to speak variously from our lived experience, myself as Chinese Canadian, herself, Liz as African American, and think about these topics from many different angles. That being said, we never had the idea of having a podcast ourselves. In fact, I think it sort of speaks to the way that community is such an important part of building confidence in oneself to think that these things are possible. It so happened that I had this reading group, an Asian American Studies reading group, actually. And one of our members, Shelley, had actually a radio show at the campus radio and invited us all on to talk about the then new series Fresh Off the Boat. And Liz so happened to tune in, and it was funny because she was like texting me while I was responding to questions. And then afterwards, a friend of mine that also now friends with Liz, Dexter Thomas, was like, "How about you do a podcast?" And I was like, "Well, if I did it, I feel like I should do it with Liz because we have a lot to talk about together." And so I think it's one of those things where conversations with friends really grow into other things. I think it's notable to mention now that Dexter is doing his postdoc at Princeton, but he also took a break from academia after doing his PhD, and he has become both an Emmy and a Peabody winning video journalist for Vice News. And so he has really like taken the sort of sense of the public to heart, and his work thinking about the opioid crisis, thinking about how Black culture operates in Japan and stuff like that has been so influential. But it came out of also like his work, but also showing a sort of generosity that he reached out to me as a friend to be like, I think you have something and I'm going to support you. And he did like all the technical work on our podcast for the first several episodes. And it's the logo that we still have today is thanks to him. And it's really evolved over the years since I think we founded in 2015 and now we're in 2023. And I have to say that we've been on hiatus because we've both been very busy and I'm recovered from long COVID. But I think what helped us find an audience was that we were unafraid to talk about the point from speaking from precarity. Neither of us knew if we were going to continue in academia. I think it's very easy for us to sort of reify a linear meritocratic narrative of, hey, these plucky graduate students had this idea and look, they're on the tenure track or whatever now. And the thing is, like, we never knew that was going to happen. I remember that in grad school, Liz didn't even think that she wanted to stay in academia. And we would narrate and discuss the trials and tribulations that we were going through from year to year. Like one perennial one was like the fact that like springtime, for instance, in academia is not the season of renewal and joy that exists and also in popular culture, but the season of rejection. That's when all the rejections roll out for grants and for graduate school and many other things. Yeah, and I think it's taught me a lot about having interesting conversations, but also about things like organizing advocacy at the university, which often tends to fall along disciplinary lines, even though we don't think it intend to. And thinking about issues of labor, for instance, like why is it that these are unionized people in the humanities than in STEM? Like what sort of considerations go into that? And so much has to do, I think, with the way that labor is organized, the way that things are incentivized in different disciplines and so forth. And I guess like one of the many things it has led to for me, for instance, is as Mary mentioned in my bio, I'm a BBC New Generation thinker. And so in the UK, there's actually this whole, what they call a scheme, which I think is very funny because it sounds like scheming, but for some reason that's what they call like any sort of program. So there's a scheme to bring in new voices as intellectual authorities generally into the BBC, rather than just turning to the same talking heads all the time. And it's a sort of national annual competition where we all write in with our pitches, and then we end up in this sort of Hunger Games scenario of these all-day in-person workshops where we practice our pitches and things like that. But I think that my podcasting was really essential for building my confidence and learning how to talk and write to a public, and just feeling confident enough to do that to begin with, to just even have a sense of self and sense of ego to be able to do that as anyone, but of course, particularly as a woman of color, where it's quite fraught. Because I think that one thing that Danielle and I will discuss is like, when we're talking about publicness, there's a way in which you, by necessity, by structural positioning, always end up being inadvertently more public. You're always going to be more recognized than your colleagues. Like I thought it was funny, like when I first arrived in my department and started in end of 2018, like I was the first person of color. And so it was very easy for everyone to tell who I was very quickly. And so like there's sort of publicness to that. And how that really shapes our embodiment and how we choose to perform publicness, and like when and where you choose to take part in it, because often it's not a matter of individual choice. So I think maybe I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's given Danielle a nice segue to other questions.
Yeah, there's so much to think about. And I, just to echo something you're saying around, I like that you're also, you've reminded me and my foregrounding that a lot of this a lot of these kinds of what were maybe seen as more alternative platforms or spaces to do this kind of thinking, or not because we're just these scrappy, young academics who are just resilient, but some of that might be true, but it's a lot of coming out of precarity as finding alternative means within institutions that might not recognize the kinds of conversations or the ways we have conversations as legit research. And maybe further down a conversation, I want to think about how those methods and strategies have been more institutionalized or captured, right, by our research institutions as a way of, and now it's like, okay, now they want to know how many Twitter followers you have, et cetera, right? And it becomes kind of contentious about what that's for. But yeah, I won't segue off into that direction quite yet. I just had a couple more questions around podcasting before moving into another batch of questions. And maybe maybe if you want to briefly also talk about a newer podcast that you're also involved with. And this is the C19 podcast, if I have it correctly. You're founding chair of this podcast. Could you just talk a little bit about what it is and maybe what's been different or what has been different with founding this one and what it involves?
Yeah, so I think the C19 podcast must be in its 6th or 7th year now. It's been under, I think, the third it's the third iteration of chairs. But I was the founding chair, and part of that reason why C19, which is the Society of 19th Century Americanists, chose me to run it was because of the PhD viz expertise that I had built up. And so it was funny that the sort of grassroots thing then became something that I ended up having sort of like this status in my academic organization because I had developed these like DIY scrappy skills. And what was different about C19 is that the way we envisioned it was not just like me or any of the other committee members becoming like familiar, like hosts in an hourglass sort of sense, but rather how can we build it as a platform for people to pitch and develop their own technical skills. And so C19 operates in this model where it doesn't matter how much podcasting knowledge you have, and even to be on the committee, you don't have to necessarily have podcasting knowledge, because it's so much about teaching yourself and then feeling confident to teach others. And since then, like other people from the have seen our model and, for instance, like develop their own podcasts, like Matthew Seybold for the Mark Twain Center, for instance, and Elmira has the American Vandal podcast. I know that a lot of people end up using the podcasts or taking podcasting into their classrooms, for instance. And really, it's like a way for people to showcase their research and talk to a wider public, have an excuse to say, like, reach out to those senior scholars or other junior scholars that you collaborate with, have a conversation about your research and things like that. And be creative, use music, use interviews, all these playful things for research and pedagogy. One of the most listened to episodes is one that I produced that was pitched and hosted by Professor Caretha Mitchell, called "The N-Word in the Classroom, Just Say No." And in it, Caretha talks about her policy about when the N-word appears in 19th century American texts, as it is often wont to do, and what to do about it. And her point is not simply to avoid saying it, because her point is also like that gives it a lot of power, and also that means that students will be avoidant about thinking critically about like the passages in which it appears. Instead, her solution for that and other slurs is to just be able to just say the first letter of it, so just say N, so as a type of placeholder, so you can still work with the language and pay attention to who is saying it, what context is emerging, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been such a useful pedagogical tool. I found myself like pretty much bringing it up every semester, and I know that that's the case for many others. And so I think it's made a real difference for people's pedagogy, but also people's experience of teaching, to feel engaged, included, and not simply just arbitrary. I guess like a point I also want to make about podcasting in general technology is like there's sort of this joke now about podcasting that you see on social media about like it's about dudes talking to each other, right? It's like the joke about like, oh, no, if you leave a mic out, then like two dudes, usually two white dudes, usually two straight dudes, will just end up like talking about their thing and making a podcast. And I think that's also a reason why it's been really important that Liz and I did that. Did PhD viz as two women of color, and then like the C19 podcast, when I first did it, like half of them were women. Almost no, I don't think anyone was tenured. Quite a few people were contingent. And currently the co-chairs are both women as well. Ashley Ratner and oh goodness, oh no, I forget her name, even though I sent their email the other day. I have to apologize for that. But yeah, I'm really proud of like the work that has been continued. And I think that thinking about the gendered and racial components of a voice and literally speaking as a voice of authority is incredibly important. And I'm sure that sound studies, people could probably say a little bit more, but I think that maybe that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've anticipated what I, was going to ask, which was around podcasting as a medium and strategy and as a format, right, in general. And I guess I've been seeing also like you a lot on my social media around like jokes around like just banning podcast mics, because the very presence of them will just and bring out very far right indoctrination and men just talking to each other, which is just like it's become kind of a meme itself, but has very real, I think very real consequences, right? Of, you can think about who, I don't know if he still has the largest podcast, I don't name him, but, the very big podcasts that
Yeah.
spread like all sorts of, misogynist, racist, fascist, anti-science stuff, right? As being the big podcast is something I've been thinking about, just in terms of what about the medium and format and give shape to that, or if it's not about that at all. But I guess my last question, we could shift it this way to land on is what you think about the future or the shifts of podcasting as a medium and the scholar's role in it, right? We kind of named all the different ways that podcasts have and are used, and I get the sense that they're proliferating, or at least I feel like I'm overwhelmed by how many podcasts there are, both by scholars and non-scholars and folks on pop culture, journalists, and then you have far right indoctrination, men talking podcasts, horrible dating podcasts, those sorts of things. And then my guilty pleasure podcast on The Bachelor series franchise, so there's now it runs the gamut. I'm very curious, as someone who has experience, right, with the technical, conceptual, and scholarly side of podcasting, where you think it's going, if it's going in a particular direction, and whether it remains worthwhile, or what is its role in thinking in relationship to public scholarship or academia.
Mm. I think like the way that the bar has been lowered for entry, in terms of having to have technical knowledge has been really fantastic, and like that really explains the proliferation of voices, including ones that we might not be fond of. And also I'd highlight shifts, for instance, like that the NPR's Invisibilia is now hosted by two women of color, for instance, which I think is really important. I think that, yeah, the proliferation generally is healthy. I often think in another context, the way that an Asian American scholar, Viet, I actually don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, Viet Thanh Nguyen, talks about like narrative plenitude for minoritized people, in terms of like that it's not just about like, it's not about good representations or bad representations, but plenitude. And I think there's something about the podcasting landscape and plenitude which is really important. But then the way that it ends up being hierarchized and variously monetized or circulated, that is where the issue comes into play. And I think that there's something very intimate about the medium of voice, which perhaps shows how potentially intimate, but also transformative, but also insidious it can be, because it's a different type of immersion. It allows you to multitask in different ways, but also because we're such an ocular-centric culture, it challenges us differently. And I think it's interesting that there has been this renaissance of thinking about the audio. And yeah, there's, I think, multiple consequences to that, in terms of like refining our sensibilities for what we listen to, that even as we're listening to more, like to what extent is it a critical listening? And I guess that's another problem, because the bar for entry is so low, and that has been like the way that so many grassroots far right figures have managed to literally make their own stage just by like having a mic. To the issue of public scholarship, um, someone who I think could speak to it far better than I think may have been one of the first people in this series for the Hub, is of course Professor Hannah McGregor, who is known for doing the podcast Witch Please, as well as Secret Feminist Agenda. And she worked with Wilfrid Laurier University Press to put together this whole series of guidelines on how is possible to make a podcast peer-reviewed research. And I highly recommend people check it out. And I think it's really thoughtful and provocative. And it's something that, for instance, I've given a couple talks about podcasting at this point, one may imagine, at different conferences, including MLA. And I've made sure to like talk about the work that Hannah has done, because like this is, in terms of course, like the gold standard, so to speak, of academia, like having that labor recognized as work, as another form of thinking, another form of community building, another form of research, means taking different standards into account. And I think it's amazing that Hannah has done that work. That being said, it's not something that I've pursued for myself, because one reason why I've turned to podcasting as opposed to, one might say, the more logical thing to turn to for public scholarship as a scholar of English literature is to write. But personally, writing is exhausting. I only have the capacity to do so much writing. I know there's a number of people here who are managed to like be wonderful creative writers as well as academic writers. For me, all writing comes out of a very limited fount, and I can't simply like switch my brain on and off into different modes. And so for me, talking is just easier. Um, I One thing I've said before about thinking about public scholarship, though, is I don't like the way it often seems to come out of this like overwhelming pressure to professionalize, as if having the right CV is the solution to getting a job in academia. And I'd really caution against that mentality. Instead, what I think is more important is to think about what nourishes you. And in my case, doing these things that make community and have to do with connecting with friends were things that were sustaining me regardless of what the outcomes were. And I think ultimately that was what was most important for me.
Yeah, thank you. You've given us so much to think about. I'm taking all these notes for myself and also for the conversation, but for myself, right? I think something you touched on might help us think about maybe perhaps some questions from this next batch of possible points, but was around the temporality or the work of writing as a particular, folks who do this, especially academic, or what has been historically understood as academic writing, is it feels like I'm pulling from a different part of my body even, right? In writing that, where yeah, the other mediums you're naming or the other formats, and also the collaborative and community-based, or at least community-born discussions, or discussions coming out of friendships, reading groups, feels like it's a different kind of energy, yeah, and a different kind of pull. Yeah, so that's really neat to think about. So perhaps we could shift a bit into thinking about a number of questions under what I categorize as kind of really kind of silly, but thinking about the public in academia and the academic in public, which we can sort of think about near the end if we have time. And I'm thinking just to foreshadow, I was kind of curious about your thoughts on, and our thoughts around like representations or like fictional depictions or cinematic TV depictions of academia and the academic as a particular kind of figure, which seems to be picking up steam around. There's something there, right, with what's pleasurable or horrific or funny, even, right, about academics in the world. So I'm bookmarking that as something we can land on. But I guess just to start us off with folding in a couple of questions that have been pre-submitted into to us. I guess one way to launch off the question of writing about publics or writing in publics for the public What have been your experience? What have been our experiences of writing about, for instance, unfolding or current political events that are ongoing in public discourse? What is the role of research or scholarship in public advocacy, which is something you brought up briefly previously? One question that was submitted to us, and I want to keep their wording: how do we reduce rather than exacerbate pre-existing inequalities in public research? Is that one way you understand public research? So those are just a grouping of questions to think basically about the experience of writing about things that, events, concerns, discourses in the public. That's one way of approaching this topic. Do we see this as public advocacy? If we do, what is the role of research or scholarship or the scholar in public advocacy? What does that look like? And perhaps we can also reflect in answering that. Right, of course, the questions of inequity, inequalities, access, right? When we think about these questions. Do you want to respond to that? Or yeah, I'll let you respond and then I'll respond.
Thank you, Danielle. Let's see where to begin. I guess I'll speak to something that is most urgent and is probably on everyone's radar, which is the level of anti-trans sentiment in the UK. And this is something that is very close to my heart because I have many trans friends, colleagues, students. And it's something that's incredibly loaded and really important for scholars in general, but particularly like scholars of feminism, gender, queer theory, trans studies, race, colonialism, as I am, and I'm sure many people are also interested in, because what is happening in the UK, unlike the sort of transphobia we see in like the States, for instance, is on both sides of the political spectrum, but also because it's particularly wielding academic freedom as an excuse. And so I feel like I think I was always good. I was always following trans studies because I felt like, as someone who worked on all these issues, like I had to be responsible to it. And the way that's how I tend to think about things. Like I can't think of myself in terms of this discipline without thinking about all these other things and this and how this situatedness, or like my positionality as someone who is an Asian diasporic settler on an indigenous land when I was at enriched spaces, for instance, like that. And I've been experiencing for the last few years, ever since I moved here, how intense that conversation is. That, for instance, I'm thinking where to begin. Because there was this now notorious public letter to The Guardian claiming that trans rights were against academic freedom, I was utterly horrified to see that, and a large number of signatories came from my university in particular. And so I ended up collaborating with a number of trans colleagues to put on the first trans studies symposium at the university. And I think it was really important as a sort of gesture to show, like, no, that we do have trans staff, colleagues, community members, and this is like an actual field of study, as opposed to the way that people who had no background whatsoever on either the science or the history or the theoretical study of gender and sex were sort of wading into this conversation. That being said, the sort of publicness is something that gets thrust upon you. So even though it was something where we actually planned for whether or not we would get attacked by trolls and stuff like that, we still got infiltrated. And there was a way that our conference was forced into public, and one of our speakers got bombarded by all this transphobia. And because I was on Twitter as well, like I got only a little bit, a fraction of what they did. And so this made us, we really had underestimated the extent to which they wanted to blow these things up into something that would be public. Because this like trans people's right to privacy of their own bodies, their own medical histories is seen as like public business. And likewise, then also us trying to make space for trans scholars as well as for trans studies meant that we'd be placing ourselves in the public. And I think that was a very eye-opening experience. From that, we ended up, me and one of my co-organizers, Ezra Horbury, ended up writing an essay for Transgender Studies Quarterly called Eugenics and Empire, and basically about why is there a particular type of transphobia in the UK. And we reflected on our experience as well as the way that UCL has a pivotal role in the history of eugenics. Indeed, Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics, although never having official position, like his main disciples worked at UCL. There's many places and around campus that are named after him, for instance. And the way that I saw it is like this transphobia is continuous with imperial race science, with eugenics, with the sort of absolute essentialization of identity towards like a type of racialized, gendered, reproductive futurity that requires like binary gender, for instance. And we wrote this piece, and it continues to be an essay that I find people pick up on unusual ways. And here's a fun thing. So I feel like I've been talking a lot of grim things. That I got a message from a friend of mine who is a Gen Z person. And they told me, oh, there's someone on TikTok who's talking about you. And I was like, what's going on? And it turned out that like a young scholar who was thinking about doing an MA in like anti-trans discourse had found her essay and did this whole TikTok that was going viral, talking about the points from our essay. And it was so funny that the algorithm like was so on point that it was multiple friends, queer and trans friends in the UK were telling me like TikTok has recommended this video that cites you, as well as even queer friends in Canada also saying that the algorithm was recommending it to them. So I thought that was like a very funny, like accidental publicness, but also sort of shows like with trans studies, like because there's been such a fraught relationship between the the populations who are studied and those who are doing the studying, and sometimes they're one and the same. Like trans people are reading trans studies much in the same way that like we could think about the way that Native studies has been working with and against anthropology as a field and the history of ethnography, for instance. And so that's something that's very similar is happening. And so like again, there's certain things that you're working on like are by necessity going to be more public. It's going to be read by people in the community, even though we're used to thinking of journals as having particular barriers to them. Like a friend of mine who is a Native scholar of Native studies says like that's one consideration they always have in mind when they publish, because they know that despite the usual perception of peer-reviewed scholarship being only access to academics, like they're like, no, the communities that I write about and write to, people are going to read this. Like this is, and what does it mean to actually be accountable to them? Because it has a matter of such urgency of immediate, often community safety, of fights for sovereignty in those instances. And most recently, there was a major anti-trans conference that happened at my university. And because I'm currently the co-director of QCL, the Queer Studies Network, my co-director, Dr. Simon Locke, and I wrote a statement without actually referencing any of the people at that conference or the conference itself, but just saying that we have the position that it is unacceptable or we really question allowing people known for anti-trans, anti-queer views when they are deeply tied to histories of anti-Semitism, racism, colonialism, eugenics, and the danger of when we think academic freedom means a lack of care and rigor and responsibility. This is just a short statement that we wrote and circulated. Turned out it got covered by one of the national newspapers, The Telegraph, which is very right-wing and a Rupert Murdoch publication. And the headline was something like University Lecturers Connects Women's Conference to Eugenics, which I was like, actually, that's true. I actually didn't read the thing myself because it was paywalled. But it just sort of shows that like, because these things are particularly fraught, these things that will pick up steam, that some things, sometimes it's not a question of like, I'm going to bring this public, but sometimes the public will just out of necessity find you. And it's about protecting yourself and taking precautions. In this case, like we also prepared for the fact that we might be individually trolled, which didn't end up happening on our social media accounts, or like having people call for our firing, which definitely has happened for many marginalized scholars speaking out on issues like anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and so forth. That being said, I could say that I am not looking forward to checking my department mailbox, because I do know that people who have spoken out the way that I have at my institution have received transphobic and homophobic stuff. And because we're academics, another way that we're public is just if you look up our university profiles, everyone has our email. Everyone could know where our office is. And this can be like real issues of safety that need to be taken into consideration? So I feel like that's a very long answer. To the question that was posed about existing inequalities in the public, I think uh, part of that is making sure that we further democratize like access to, say, technical skills, but also continually affirm everyone around us to that they should be able to pursue things that will make them flourish. Whether or not that leads to the public or not shouldn't matter, though. I feel like it's not like a particularly rigorous program of it, but also like I think one thing we could also do is that if we do have any sort of platform, how do we make it a space for others? And so with PhD, is the thing that Liz and I did. Like we had many other women, often women of color, and some cases trans women, queer women, speaking on our podcast, and it was a way of just like give the platform we had to others. Again, the C19 podcast was about making a space for a lot of different people to have their voices heard that had never done that sort of work before. And knowing when you're the right person to do it. Like for the transgender studies quarterly piece, like I knew that I immediately reached out to Dr. Ezra Horbury to be my to help write it with me, and they also have gone on to do like publish other work in trans studies. Really importantly, with PhDivas, like for me, it was about the collaboration that I wanted to do it with Liz, and so I think that whenever we can think of ourselves not as individuals but as the collective, and who can we help build with and help bring up, and who can we then encourage to continue to pay this forward, is just part of this ongoing network that is about horizontal collaboration, about just reversing the usual hierarchical vertical structure of academia, and blurring the boundaries between like academia and the public. And you never know like the way that people will pick it up. Like I've met so many people I never just through the podcast, that when I started my job, it turned out that a feminist scholar at UCL, was listening to the podcast and heard that I was coming to England and coming to UCL, and she reached out to me, and now we're friends. And so there's this way in trying to build community and being very, I think, intentional and explicit about building a community that people will also reach out to you for their community. And it's been very sustaining for me personally.
Yeah, there's so much to think about that you shared. Thanks for that. I was also just thinking, as in your comments, how the kind of often perceived bifurcation between like the public and what we mean by the public, or public's like such a capacious term and contested term. And versus like the public versus scholarship, or public and scholarship, that bifurcation that, you know, often through that we're often encouraged to blur, has already been historically, right, blurred, or not. That bifurcation isn't there, right, historically, especially when you think about genealogies of, you know, critical thought, that has been entangled with social political action, and organizing. And I would say for many, for people of color, for feminists of color, right, for many minoritized peoples, the critical thinking and the public scholarship, and well, I guess what we would now see as scholarship, but, you know, critical thinking, critical theory, and the public, because this is kind of like capital P public, have never been this, you know, clear demarcation. And I'm like really hearing this in the way you talk about being conscious of building space as you're doing this work, for other folks, to do what makes them flourish too, right? And I'm also thinking about how a lot of this work comes out of your existing relationships and building relationships with other folks. So that's really cool to hear about. I'll just add a couple of comments to this question, because I see myself, I have to admit, I don't really understand myself as a public scholar, mainly because a lot of my research, and then my kind of what we could categorize as like community organizing or community work, don't seem to meet in very clear ways, at least, or visible ways. I would see myself, like, I guess I would understand more myself as a scholar who is concerned with the public, in that my work, it takes up, or is informed by what public discourse is interested in, right? And what's pressing, right? to those conversations, if that makes sense. So I mean, a couple of examples I can think of is, my piece on the Muslim ban, which was a 2017 executive order directive under the Trump administration. If folks remember, it temporarily banned travelers from 7, and then a couple more countries were added, 7 Muslim majority countries. And it was a piece I wrote that kind of brought together an article. It was a peer-reviewed article that brought together under the event, I guess, if you will, of the Muslim ban, these longer histories, but also brought together all these other questions that would be difficult to write in a shorter kind of news article piece, right? So it was about face detection technologies, everyday social media apps, race and border securitization, right, and Twitter. So it was like all these kind of different topics that I understood as pressing onto one another in that moment. And those ongoing that index of particular ongoing history, that the longer form academic article gave space or afforded those kinds of weird intersections. But what was great about that was that that piece came out, the article came out and was an open access special issue. So got to share it with folks. And what you said also, that, we often think about the parameters and the restrictions of peer review articles for sure, but also that there is a responsibility that we feel in writing even in that format, because we know people are reading, and like you, people have emailed me or DM'd me to be like, can I have access to that piece? And what's nice about that piece is like that piece in particular is available online, right? It's open access. Same with a couple of other peer reviewed articles I've got a chance to write. So there's a way in which I think about, like what's the journal's vision, or what's the journal's policy around making work available, making scholarship available and to broader publics, is something to think about. And another note I would add just quickly is that sometimes I think about, as academics, we talk about our archives, even in the very scholarly sense, like even in an academic monograph, what is the archive that you're assembling or engaging with? And because I work in like new media, social media, something that I've been reflecting on is that often the archive for me is public, in that they're accessible by most folks in North American contexts, right? So they're usually open. Well, it used to be, tweets, and that's a question around Twitter, but so tweets are open, in that the Muslim ban article, the archive, or all the research I did, even with patent documents. So I did like a weird crawl of patent documents for Snapchat's facial detection algorithm, which is this weird, sold by this Ukrainian a tech company that developed the apps that developed the algorithm for like all your fun Snapchat filters. So but that's actually available online. So yeah, I guess one question that we could keep thinking about, or I want to keep thinking about as I develop my work as a scholar, as a thinker, is around whether others can also, around where your archive is located, and for whom is it an archive, right? Is it just an archive for me in my personal project, in my special research directions, or is there something, what makes it an archive also is the other question. So the idea of the publicness of the archive, or the collectiveness, I guess, about certain events, documents, and texts should matter. Yeah, that's another note I'll flag there. I'm just conscious of time. We have maybe about 10-ish more minutes in our conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I'll skip ahead, if that's okay, in a couple of questions, unless, there were a couple of questions we were going to discuss around the factors we consider in terms of sharing, researching, doing work meant for broader publics. But I think you've had so much to share about that, Xine, that I think if people want to ask more about that in terms of specific factors considered, we can take it up in the Q&A. Do you want to add anything though? Or
I guess like a quick little caution I'd say is like, as much as I I support open access. Like I think that there's a sort of hidden problem also of open access, which has to do with the finances of it, because my understanding is some disciplines, like in order to publish open access, they require thousands of dollars. And so it becomes very restrictive. And there's also things about like the fact that like university presses are not for profit. And so it becomes very difficult for them to also do open access. And so there's something that's happening in the UK that's quite insidious, which is part of this way that all academic departments in the UK get evaluated on the caliber of their research every 7 years. And then funding is allocated accordingly. And so we have the absurdity of the fact that a panel, say for English, of maybe 5 people means that your peer-reviewed scholarship, which has been approved by people who are in your field, are then going to also be evaluated on its quality by people who are not in your field. And you can imagine that this would be a nightmare for if you work on issues like, you know, queer theory or Asian American studies, which don't exist in the UK, or Asian Canadian studies, things like that. It's absolutely loaded and really insidious, and becomes a sort of other type of insidious meritocratic logic of further underfunding public education. And part of how the rep has been operating is like compelling people to do open access without actually making it, and trying to make it mandatory across disciplines without taking into consideration which publishers are able to do that, which places have, and which scholars have the funds. And so what we're seeing increasingly is like, what would be my nightmare is like that university presses in North America are not going to be considered viable for academic monographs because they don't typically do open access because of different resource these things. Instead, that could push us more towards like publishers like Springer that are for-profit publishers that have very insidious histories like Elsevier and so forth. And so it actually becomes a logic that positions itself as being for public, but it's actually quite corporate and capitalist. So I was like, that was like just a very quick thing that I just wanted to register. But like, I'm really happy that I have just had an article come out that was open access at an American literary history. And so that was really cool, but I feel like there's another side of it that I also just quickly wanted to highlight.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a really helpful caveat, right? In thinking about how the privatization of the public, right? There's a way in which the for-profit model creates, right? Like as you're saying, the access, right? And it's really about, well, yeah, it's really about rethinking, right, research and the institutionalization of research in towards like a greater, towards a larger picture, right, of community engaged work. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to skip some questions if that's. I wanted to touch on kind of a fun note around right, the academic in public, or the academic in popular culture, and I think both of us in different ways think about the public, but also popular cultural phenomena in our scholarly work and in our critical work. But on the other side of that, there's also, you know, this uptake in popular cultural productions of the university, or at least elite teaching institutions, and the academic as a figure within those representations. So I'm just like thinking of course, not to turn this into the chair panel, which it's not, but of course, right, in Asian diasporic, Asian American, Asian Canadian study circles, like there's the chair that we all kind of texted each other about, whether we liked it or not. There's this I think it's an Amazon Prime production, Master, which is more of the horror genre. I'm thinking also about, like, it's silly, but you know, I just kind of binged You, which is like this Netflix series, right, with Penn Badgley. Yeah. And also, of course, we could even lump something like Tar, the film Tar, in it, which is not really about a professor, but takes the site of the post-secondary, right, classroom lecture hall as a kind of central site of clashing, generationally, culturally, but also of the abuses of power, we could say also. so there's much to say, and there's a lot of examples we can go to, but just interested in your thoughts about why, or what this might index or tell us about this kind of fascination by the public or popular cultural representations of the academe and the academic.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Where to begin? I guess one thing also to say that's even beyond that is like the very fact that like dark academia has become this whole aesthetic. Some people don't know. It's like this sort of the social media phenomenon of like of various things becoming aesthetics, but particularly dark academia has had particular traction. And also it's basically the sort of fetishized model of elite New England and elite like Oxbridge type academia. And despite the name dark academia, it often like the initial conceptions were often like quite white as well, which has come under a lot of critique. And yeah, it's something that really compels the imagination, and I think perhaps compels all the different depictions that you're talking about of academia and these popular culture shows. One thing I guess that comes to mind that is really interesting is I think that we're having more conversations than ever about union organizing and striking in academia because things are at such a crisis point within North America, within the UK. Like I'm part of a union, and we're going into another series of strikes, for instance. Graduate student unions happening at so many different places, and that labor issues compounded with the way that labor issues are tied up with so many forms of inequality, racial and gendered, are not really what tends to be translated in these in so many of these popular culture depictions. Like it seems like so many of them are still caught up in the fantasy of academia still being tied to a certain class ideal. Whereas I'm sure that Danielle and I could probably say that although we're extremely fortunate to be in the position of being junior faculty, and we could never underestimate that. In places, living in places like Vancouver and London, it doesn't actually mean economic security necessarily. But of course, it's like a fraction of the precarity that we experienced beforehand. And so it's been interesting not to see, like the chair probably comes the closest to that sense of precarity because it shows the way that her acceptance is so conditional. But then for you, for instance, I think it was funny seeing in UK academia people responding to it because, of course, out of nowhere, without a PhD, he gets a job, and apparently only one teaching one module, as the Brits say it, at Royal Holloway, which is very beautiful, but is really far out of London, is apparently enough to live in central London. And apparently he lives in like Kensington, and people were saying like, okay, so somehow he just does a 15-minute walk from Kensington, central London, to Royal Holloway, which is like zone 6 or zone 7. And so, and especially that coming out at the time when there's a huge cost of living crisis in the UK, there's a crisis around heating. People are literally not able to afford enough food or to heat their homes. And it's particularly felt in the UK because one thing I learned, like housing in the UK is worse insulated than in North America. Somehow it's worse against heat and worse against cold. So it really cuts the bone in a real sense. And so all those things are driving the way that higher education, not just academics, but also our professional services staff, we're all striking, but alongside we're striking along doctors, alongside nurses, along different trade unions. And yet then comes out, you, Penn Bagley, like, oh, look at this, how easy it is to get an academic job and have such a swanky life. So I feel like there's something that's going on maybe in the area of class warfare is my thought.
Totally. I think that was my first note. I was like, it seems like there's a larger implication of elite, these kind of older colonial institutions, their implication in class struggle, right? That becomes the meeting of the questions of movements in class struggle, especially with like growing what feels like more proliferation of eat the rich kind of media, finds itself right in these sites, which are also particularly seen as outdated. but also representing a particular kind of wealth or a time of wealth too, even if that particular instructor or professor, as you're naming, right, and has experienced less precarity in being a professor, but doesn't always quite line up in neat ways, right, into everyone's experiences teaching and working, right? Obviously, I'm also thinking about more precarious folks, adjunct sessional contract workers, right? And staff and folks in these institutions. So I was thinking, yeah, like, of course, there's this kind of growing, pressing, right, desire, interest in fictional, but cultural representations of class struggle, and also these sites that feel very much like, of time past, but also the site of particular abuse of power was another theme that feels really pressing, right? That these are the locations for exploring and interrogating, but also in weird ways, fantasizing about, right, potential for the questions around abuses of power, but also, with the chair, with Tar, even a bit, it's also the question of what happens when women, minoritized folks, people of color occupy the positions of power that were not granted to them, right, in generations past. Do they reproduce power, or what happens differently? In the chair, whether we liked it or not, was trying to wrestle with that, I think. But lots to say around that. And one quick thing I would note before we maybe move into some questions from folks who are in the room, is like the specificity of English departments. We could say a lot about, right, that the English department, both for you and the chair, is the site of this struggle, or is the site of this tension, a kind of cultural, generational, and classed, racialized, right, tension and struggle. And I wonder, that just has to, I wonder, one thought to throw out there is like the kind of overlapping between markets. So there's that the literary market, which is already always has shaped and continues to shape and be shaped by English as a discipline. That literary markets, film, TV, other entertainment industries are, they're entangled, right? And so there's a way in which the literary and the discipline of English seeps and leaks into as a kind of genre, or as a premise, right, for writers, for screen. And that folks in academia who have had experience in academia, I'm gonna think about the writer for the chair, one of the writers for the chair, who was a PhD student, right? That's moving, that those lines are kind of blurred, right? Especially when we think about folks who have academic backgrounds or experiences in academic institutions, who then do work in, for Netflix or for other kinds of screenplay or screenwriting based work. So it's just interesting to think more about those kinds of weird phenomena. I see that there's a number of questions, or that perhaps Sydney can help us move into for the rest of our time together.
Yeah, there were quite a few comments in the chat that I think were sort of like, yes, we also see it here. And then there's also this genre, right? The genre of the death of the humanities in the US, for instance. But there's no questions that are in the chat. So if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask something out loud, feel free to do so. And if not, then we can continue having this very fantastic conversation. Does anyone want to start us off? Let's give it a minute in case people are formulating.
Actually, I wanted to respond to JP's comment about Henry Higgins and proximity in My Fair Lady. That on the one hand, it's so interesting that, like, of course, My Fair Lady was based on George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, but Pygmalion ends completely differently than My Fair Lady. At the end, she, like, flips him off and, like, walks away from him. And, like, it's a critique then of that sort of femininity and the way it's classed and so forth. And of course, like, the thing that enters popular culture is the sanitization in My Fair Lady, that she, this was one of my grandpa's favorite movies, so I know this. Like, the final thing he says, like, Liza, where is my slippers? And then she, like, comes and, like, meekly brings him her slippers. And coming here, I didn't realize how true it was in that UK academia. people's accents. So as a non-Brit, my accent doesn't get coded in this way, but British academics pretty much all have posh accents and a posh Southern accent. And basically, people having any sort of working class or regional accent is something that gets beaten out of them, basically, as they go on to academia because it marks them regionally and marks them in terms of class. And accents are so particularized in a way that I didn't realize, in a way that's far more granular than I've ever seen in the US or Canada, that people can tell you to know which city people are from. People can even say like what side of a city people are from. And they'll be like, oh, this is a liberal, this is a Scouse accent, this is a Mancunian accent. And I was like, I have no idea what that means. And in a sort of funny way, it became this other aspect of this class hierarchy and also racial hierarchy in the UK that I was oblivious to because my ear couldn't even pick up those nuances. So I had no idea who was more or less privileged or anything like that. So just be like, oh, okay. But that's, yeah, something I just wanted to comment on because I just had no idea how alive Henry Higgins would be.
Yeah, JP, go ahead if you had more to say.
Well, on that note, thank you so much to both of you for the fascinating discussion. I want to pick up on the notion of voice and tonality because it travels to podcasting as a medium outside of the classroom. I remember a former professor of mine and a dear colleague now, Minal Matani, who has worked in radio, had talked before about the radio voice and training the voice for radio. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that in relation to podcasting, if that if that is a thing, and the kind of pedagogical curricular projects around training for these kinds of media.
I think that's a great question, especially because, like, of course, people talk about the NPR voice, and of course, the BBC voice is a thing. And my partner even jokes that, like, oh, you're using your BBC voice now because I apparently go into a completely different register. A friend showed one of my BBC podcasts to one of her friends, and she's like, oh, Xine doesn't normally sound like this. She's way more sarcastic. Like, there's this sort of way that I didn't realize that in trying to just slow down and enunciate, I guess I just ended up self-policing in terms of my tone. But I wouldn't say it's something that was said formally. It's more like I guess it just comes through in other more insidious ways. But I would want to raise that one of the PhD of his podcasts that Liz and I did was with a friend of mine, Meredith Toulousan, who might be known to people as a trans Filipinx writer. Her memoir, Ferris, came out like a year or two ago. She was the first openly trans editor of LGBT BuzzFeed and one of the founders of the online publication Them. But anyways, we had her on the podcast and she's talking about like writing for the public and the way that like particularly like she was writing in The Guardian and the New York Times about her experience as a trans woman of color and especially one with albinism. And one thing that she talked about and like on our podcast, but also I've seen her refer to is of course like that voice training for trans people is such a big thing. It's not just, but on the one hand, there's like the effect that hormones have, but also like a lot of trans people also do voice training in order to pass, and what it means to sort of also resist that. And so I guess that is one thing that I also have in mind that like I guess PH Divas, because from our very name is about occupying a certain type of womanhood or femininity, and yeah, trans inclusion is an important part of that for coding like a range of voices, accents, registers. Yeah. I guess I want to respond to Danielle that you bringing up TAR and the chair is that it's both interesting in both cases, like that the fact that there is some sort of accountability that ends up happening for these woman of color academic and a white woman who's academic adjacent. And when we know that that type of accountability is so rare, and on the one hand, there's a phenomenon I think is called the glass cliff that Black women in professional settings are particularly subjected to, where sometimes they're only given positions of authority under crisis, and obviously with 2020 that has happened across so many institutions, but then they're being given positions of leadership precisely at which they're expected to fail. And that's also a bit of what Sandra Oh's character has to go through. But then Tar was interesting because I saw this Medium piece the other day about, like, depending on who you are, Tar is either a tragedy or it's a satire. And like the joke of, like, when I saw it with my friends, you're like, what? The bad person actually got a comeuppance in academia? What? And yeah, and the sort of joke that even happened at all actually being part of the fantasy, whereas other people might be like, oh, so terrible that Lydia Tarr was taken down by the politically correct BIPOC. And I feel like that's really interesting and telling in and of itself. And I think that there's a way that the film, in some of its opacity, allows for those different readings that could be, I don't know, either cynical or also quite generative. Something, not to be too subtweety about it, but one thing I wanted to snark on is, for those of you who've seen Tar and she ends up in Asia, you probably know that she's in the Philippines, right? But I was having this sort of Twitter conversation with some people who thought misidentified the country, and also who's saying, like, no, it's just a generic Asian country. And it's like, it is not a generic Asian country if you can tell what language they're speaking and what place it is. And it's, I think that was very telling, because it's like they're saying, like, no, it is generic, or it is this picker country because it's this commentary. It's like the fact that you non-Asian people think it's generic and then misidentify the country is kind of like doing the thing. And if anything, like, the movie is letting you tell on yourselves. Just saying.
Yeah, that's so true. I wanted to add to that and just maybe engage also with something in the chat from a participant, Rochelle. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but the idea, yeah, that the comeuppance at the end, right? Sorry to spoil the film, but it's been out, okay, for a while. As playing video game music, so there's like this hierarchy of aesthetic judgments and tastes as built into this, right, world of the elite, because she's a Lydia Tarr, the main character, is a sort of a composer, but mainly a composer slash conductor of what we might understand as more classical music, right? This kind of Eurocentric, and that's the center of debate, right? It's the way that the arts is raced, classed, hierarchized, and that's the center of the tension that's captured on the phone camera, right? With the Black student at Juilliard, right, where the student is like, well, they're like, well, why should I care about Mozart or Beethoven, like, who are misogynists, come out of these racist histories, and this is what's kind of like the central thing that is recalled upon her so-called cancellation at the end of the film. So there's something about the perceived clashing or the actual clashing of these elite institutions and histories that have hierarchized aesthetics, tastes, cultures, and class as a class experience, being confronted with. Well, it's a question of, like, the changes in classrooms, the changes in ways people learn and communicate and think with one another, and that's sort of the weird clash between the cell phone and the way that Lydia Tarr understands her world and her world of culture, which is kind of I guess indicated in the beginning of the film and throughout the film, where we see the weird shots of her through the smartphone camera, right? And it's supposed to, someone add to it. I think it's Rochelle.
Oh, sorry, I actually didn't mean to interrupt. Just, do you want to finish your thought? I'd love to hear it.
Well, I was just going to say, if I were to talk more about it, I was interested in two things that Xine has brought up that I'm thinking further with, is also is the role of social media, or this, like, social media as crisis, or as the site of crisis or cultural or generational class struggle. So that, like, what the role of social media in doing that, the question of so there's that, and the role of social media as a kind of site or or non-site of research and elite institutions. And what I'm realizing also from your comment, Xine, is that both in the chair and in TAR, what seems to be underlying the question of what happens when minoritized women of color, queer women are taking up these positions of power that have historically not been for them, that these institutions are fundamentally anti-Black. Like, it seems to be anchoring both those cultural productions. If we were to read them more generously, that unearth the critique of these, or makes apparent that in the tenure track structure, in research metrics, in the categorization of aesthetics and art, that underlying both of these examples is anti-Blackness. So if we think about, for instance, Sandra Oh's character, the main struggle with her at chair is the question of tenure for a non-tenured Black faculty member, right, in the department. So there's so much to say about that you've made me think about. So go ahead, Rochelle. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, this has been super fun, and I really appreciate both of you coming and sharing your expertise. And just like, I love talking about pop culture, so that is great. And my question sort of comes out of the fact, so I'm a PhD candidate and hopefully defending later this year. And all along the way, thank you. For the last like 4 years or so, I've been working in radio and media and podcasting and kind of like learning about the world of journalism and media, and like preparing for career diversity, I guess. And at least in the US, public humanities a lot of times has a high overlap with humanities students who are looking to leave or know that they may not ever get that offer of a tenure track position. And so it's almost like as much a career preparation program as it is like a methodology for within academia. And I guess I'm just curious what you make of that, that I think we're losing a lot of scholars who would bring these energies and these questions to the academy, but will not be joining the academy for a host of reasons. And also just exactly how to position yourself in this hybrid space, because in many ways, as I've been in these other worlds, I'm kind of just expected to get the training and pivot careers. And so what's different from what I'm trying to do as a public humanist, as opposed to just becoming a critic or a journalist or, you know, a radio personality or whatever it is? I feel that I'm bringing some sensibilities and methodologies to it, but in the grand scheme of things, you either end up in the academy or not. So I'm just sort of curious what you make of all that.
Oh gosh. There was this fantastic piece that came out a month ago. I don't not remember. I think it was maybe from the New Republic, that was about the contingency crisis. And there's this great phrase that people kept on quoting from it of like, the burnout that tenured people feel is the phantom limb where your lost colleagues should be, or something like that. Like that's where, and like that is an incredibly evocative way to put it. I feel like I don't necessarily have an answer, because like in the UK, I could say that like I definitely see like the same sort of urgency and need for diversification just as a means of survival. Because one thing I didn't realize in the UK is the fact that UK PhDs are not necessarily funded. A lot of them aren't. People actually pay to do their PhDs. Only some people get a meager amount of money. And so a lot of all the PhD students that I befriended were all variously minoritized, women, queer, people of color. Like they usually have side gigs doing public stuff out of necessity. And because of that, they're incredibly entrepreneurial and professional. And I know I have so many brilliant friends who, before they finish their PhD, have gotten book deals or have agents and things like that, which sounds really exciting, but it's literally because they're trying to survive and pay bills. And I have to say, like, I think it's something that always haunts people, like, particularly because there are so few Black women academics in the UK, in particular, like, in terms of Black women full professors across all disciplines. I think there's like 50 something now, which is an increase from since the first survey was done, I think in 2018. But one person that I know, and she's tweeted about this, Dr. Christina Fryer, was hired to start the first MA in Black British history at Goldsmiths. And basically, earlier she announced that she was quitting her job because Goldsmiths, after making this big thing of like putting her on all the EDI posters and saying like, oh, we have this first MA, stuff like that, like put her through the ringer to try and keep her job. And then she decided enough. And I got to know Christina because she was also a new generation thinker, and she has a book deal. And I'm really excited for when her book comes out. But it's also the sort of continued necessity that isn't just about like landing after, but also the fact that like the rug can be pulled under you from any time. And I think that's something people have to bear in mind, that we see that tenure doesn't exist in the UK, but we see that tenure is being eroded in Canada and North America and the States. That I know at least one person who got a tenure track job and then that college closed. Like precarity is writ large. It's not simply something that we can disavow. And like, that's why I keep voting to go and strike, because otherwise we're selling a pipe dream. So it's not really an answer. It's more of like, this is what I've seen.
And we are actually 6 minutes over time.
Sorry.
No problem at all. It's been a fantastic discussion. So I want to thank the audience for sticking with us. I want to thank our speakers for having such a fantastic discussion. Xine and Danielle, this has been fabulous. So that's it for us. Thank you all for coming. We will have a recording of this up on our YouTube channel. There's also been a number of resources in the chat today, so I can follow up with an email with all of those links for people. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you for having me. Take care all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Xine.
Have a great day, everyone.